Opening the center immediately, this pawn thrust aims to seize territory and free the diagonals for your bishops. Opens up a diagonal for the dark-squared bishop, and prepares a solid, albeit sometimes passive, pawn structure for black. Opening the center, white immediately challenges the pawn on d6, aiming for rapid development and a space advantage. Developing the knight here immediately challenges white's central pawn, creating dynamic tension and preparing for further piece activity. Developing a knight to its most active square, aiming to control central squares and prepare for castling. Challenging the center's structure immediately, black opens lines but invites pawn tension and a potential queenside pawn race. Striking at the center pawn, white opens a diagonal for the queen and invites immediate tactical skirmishes. Recapturing the pawn reopens the d-file, offering excellent counterplay and immediate central presence for black's forces. Exchanging queens now simplifies to an endgame, where controlling the open d-file becomes paramount for future action. Instinctively freeing the king, the black monarch ventures forth, a bold statement of active defense in this newly opened territory. Safeguarding the knight before launching a pawn attack on c6 seems prudent, aiming to control the center. Developing the bishop to attack the nc3 knight disrupts white's central pawn structure. Developing the bishop aggressively puts pressure on the f7 pawn and prepares to castle quickly. The bishop retreats, but this development opens a diagonal for white's rook and leaves black's king feeling quite exposed. Exchanging the bishop simplifies things, perhaps aiming for easier endgame play by removing a key defender. Opening the f-file is a double-edged sword, offering attacking potential but exposing your king. Activating the bishop here aims to disrupt black's developing pieces and potentially create weaknesses around their king. Relocating the monarch to safety avoids further disruption, allowing for piece development. Castling kingside now secures white's monarch, activating the rook for central influence and opening avenues for future piece development. Developing the knight to c6 aims to bolster the pawn structure and potentially challenge the center while preparing for queenside castling. Reinforcing the central pawn advances the rook's influence, preparing for a potential kingside assault. Disrupting the bishop's diagonal control, this pawn advance aims to hinder white's kingside expansion. Pivoting the bishop to a more active diagonal, this repositions white's piece to potentially influence the kingside and pressure the pawn chain. Aggressively expanding on the kingside creates significant weaknesses around your undeveloped monarch. Securing the bishop's retreat lane solidifies the kingside pawn structure and prepares for future central expansion. Unleashing the knight to a centralized outpost, disrupting white's pawn structure while subtly probing king safety. Injecting a knight to d4 promises outpost control and aims to exploit the weakened kingside structure. Activating the rook along the open file presents an immediate challenge, creating dynamic tension. Reclaiming the open file is key, but the king's remaining vulnerability on the kingside needs constant vigilance. Shifting the rook to the g-file aims to contest control and potentially disrupt white's kingside structure. Securing the king from the open file, this cautious repositioning anticipates potential threats while keeping lines of retreat open. Pawn storming on the queenside creates some positional weaknesses, but aims to disrupt white's development. The knight relocates to c1, seeking better placement on the queenside to pressure black's queenside structure. Knight boldly ventures into white's territory, aiming to disrupt their pawn structure and potentially create mating threats. Exchanging that bishop simplifies the position, opening the f-file and immediately challenging your pawn structure. Exposing your king's defenses further, this captures the pawn, but creates potential weaknesses on the kingside that can be exploited later. Fortifying the king's flank, this pawn push prepares to address the exposed knight and prevent further penetration by black's aggressive pieces. Pushing the h-pawn here creates immediate pawn tension, potentially opening lines for your pieces and weakening white's kingside. A pivot towards the queenside, aiming to redeploy this knight for better influence or perhaps targeting a structural weakness. Aggressively challenging the center pawn with this advance opens lines, but watch for king safety and piece coordination complications. Opening that h-file for your rook will be a powerful assault. Opening the h-file creates immediate attacking opportunities, exposing the white king and activating the rook. The knight repositions, aiming to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for potential advances on the king side. Piling pressure on the open file, this prepares to double rooks and challenge white's control. Sacrificing the rook on the open file opens up lines for your pieces and forces a critical decision from black. Pushing the e-pawn now invites tactical fireworks, potentially opening lines for your active pieces against the somewhat exposed white monarch. Solidifying the pawn chain, this move aims to restrict black's space and prepare for potential central breakthroughs. Relocating the king seeks central influence, but exposes it to oncoming storm. Unlocking the kingside pawn majority, though it creates a potential weakness. Opening the g-file creates immediate attacking chances, though it also exposes your king somewhat. Opening the f-file now unlocks aggressive intentions, promising an active rook poised to challenge black's exposed monarch. The knight's journey to b8 signals a retreat, perhaps preparing a central pawn push later or seeking a safer square away from the active kingside. Sacrificing the rook on h8 opens the h-file for decisive infiltration against black's exposed king. A decisive exchange opens the h-file, creating immediate attacking potential for white's king. Fianchettoing the knight offers a new attacking perspective on the kingside for white. A bold regrouping, rerouting the knight to bolster kingside pawns and potentially reroute to a more active square. Initiating a dangerous pawn sacrifice to rip open the kingside and expose the black monarch. Seeking to establish a passed pawn, black's rook ventures aggressively, but leaves its own king exposed to discovery. Pressing the knight to the edge of the board creates an immediate tactical challenge for black's king. Unleashing the rook across the board, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain active play, but it leaves the king vulnerable to pursuit. Targeting black's vulnerable pawn structure, this knight repositions to exert pressure and potentially disrupt enemy coordination. Reshaping the pawn structure here is a bold bet on creating activity for your knights. Capturing the knight eliminates a key defender, opening a path for infiltration and pawn advancement. The black king, having traded pawns and queens early, now ventures into open territory, potentially becoming a target as material diminishes. A timely knight sortie, disrupting the pawn structure and forcing the king to a more exposed square. King's reign ends. Now it must navigate open lines while the knight seeks active outposts. Seizing the open file, white opens a clear path to the black king's shelter.